I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a horrific event that touches the lives of all Americans, the mass murder at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino, California. As Jews who are very concerned with the safety of the state of Israel and the people of Israel, as we watched recently as Palestinians have attacked and murdered Jews as they walk on the streets of Jerusalem or stand at a bus stop or drive on the West Bank, we feel for the people of Israel and look for a day when violence and murder will not be a frequent occurrence on the Israeli scene. But right now, the attention of our nation is turned towards San Bernardino, the site of yet another mass murder, something which seems to be a recurring event of carnage, death, and sorrow. One American statistic is staggering in its vivid presentation of American reality today. There have been more individual incidents of mass murder in which 4 or more people have been the victims of shooting. There have been more individual acts of mass murder in America this year than there have been days in the year. The San Bernardino murders, in which at least 14 people were killed, more than 20 others injured, was the 355th separate mass shooting that's taken place in our country this year. 355. And Wednesday, the day of the mass murder, was only the 336th day of 2015. This tragedy in San Bernardino is the third mass shooting since last week's shooting at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, where a police officer and 2 civilians were killed, 7 others injured. Well, for some comment on this issue, as well as other issues confronting America today, and for analysis, I'm so pleased to be joined on our JBS phones right now by a man who's had quite a good deal of experience with, sadly, violence in America, Professor Alan Dershowitz, the longtime professor of law at Harvard Law School, and a prolific author who's written extensively on a range of legal issues. And of course, Alan is also a preeminent spokesperson in defense of the state of Israel and a profoundly committed Jew. And Alan's most recent book, I recommend it to everyone, is on the history of Jewish lawyers, and it's entitled Abraham, the world's first, but certainly not last, Jewish lawyer, available now on Amazon. And Alan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Well, thank you so much. It's a very sad day, but it's important to point out why it is that in the United States we have so many shootings, whereas in Israel, where there are horrible acts of terrorism, for the most part, recently at least, they have been done with knives rather than with guns. There have been some shootings, to be sure, but I think one reason why the knives have been so prevalent in Israel and why the numbers have not been as high as obviously terrorists would like them to be is it's much harder to kill with a knife than with a gun.
Yes.
It's much harder to kill multiple people with a knife than with a gun, and because there are not that many guns available in Israel. In Israel, for the most part, the armed forces has a monopoly on the guns, and certainly in the West Bank there are guns, but they're not as easily available as they are even in a state like California, which has pretty tough gun control laws. So, nobody can deny the relevance of the fact that there are so many guns. You talk about there are more multiple shootings in America than there are days of the year. There are also more guns in America than there are people. And the easy availability of guns means that if somebody is planning a terrorist act, they can have access to the guns. Or if somebody, we don't know what happened in San Bernardino, if somebody got very upset at a party, you go back and you get your gun. If you don't have a gun, what you do is you go back and you get frustrated and maybe you hit somebody. But the easy availability of guns is related, no matter what the gun nuts, the NRA, anybody else says, the easy availability of guns explains why President Obama was right when he says America is unique in the number of mass casualty gun shootings, whether they're terrorist-inspired or not.
Bowie, beautifully said. I want to throw at you some of the things I hear all the time from those who are less enthusiastic about gun control. And the bigger argument is that tragically, no matter how strict gun control legislation might become nationwide, the kind of murder we saw at San Bernardino or the kind of killing we saw at the Newtown school, those kind of murders would not be stopped with stricter gun control legislation. What do you say?
Well, it has to be very strict. I mean, it has to be confiscatory. It has to be to the point where we reduce the number of guns available by a dramatic amount. And that's very hard to do. It's hard to do even through gun control. Gun control is limited in what it can accomplish, again, as evidenced by the fact that there are high crime rates. There have been mass shootings in Illinois, Chicago, which has tough gun laws. New York has tough gun laws. California has tough gun laws. Gun laws alone won't do it. It will contribute, but it won't do it. What you need is massive change in attitude among Americans about guns and about gun ownership. You also need more access to mental health facilities. A lot of the people who do this have serious mental illness, no indication that this was the case in California, but there's a lot of that around, and, you know, the glorification of violence. We see it so often, these games now that kids are being brought up on, where you score the most if you kill the most people in the most brutal possible way. The glorification of ISIS in many parts of the world, all of this contributes to an atmosphere where human life is just devalued, where you can walk into a mental health facility and murder 14 people in cold blood and injure 17. I mean, it's just unthinkable. It's not the kind of world any of us wants to live in.
And yet, Alan, again, we see it more and more. I thought your comment about President Obama's remarks in, I don't remember if I think it was in Paris at the time. I thought they were very apt. Many people are so critical these days of President Obama, especially those who are against him in general. But his comment about how this is typical of America in a way that's not typical of any other country in the world. Alan, it's just factually correct, is it not?
No, it is factually correct. Look, I wish President Obama would remember that there is a country called Israel, and when he condemns these actions, occasionally include Israel in the victims. He tends to want to almost go out of his way not to do that, even when that young American boy from Maimonides High School was murdered in cold blood.
Yes.
You know, it took him forever to say anything.
Yes.
He seems to have almost instinctive negative view toward including Israel when it comes to terrorism. Ban Ki-moon, the head of the most bigoted world organization in modern history, the United Nations, gave a list of places that have been plagued by terrorism. And he went to every small country that has had 2 or 3 terrorist acts and conspicuously omits Israel, which has been the center point where terrorism was invented by the PLO initially, by Yasser Arafat, by his predecessor Husseini, and by his successors. The idea of not including terrorism against Israeli civilians is just appalling, and we see it all over the world. We see it on college campuses, we see it at the UN, and tragically we see it in the White House.
Yes, yes. So, Alan, what's your feeling about the Second Amendment? And do you feel that it has been misunderstood?
I mean, if I were drafting the Bill of Rights, I would have drafted a Bill of Rights like the Bill of Rights in almost every other Western country in the world. Nobody has a Bill of Rights that includes the right to have a gun. It's just not one of the rights that's included. You know, Bills of Rights talk about freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Sometimes they talk about freedom from want. Nobody but America talks about guns. And, of course, Second Amendment was never intended to give people personal rights to own guns. A well-regulated militia being essential, etc.
Yes.
The right to guns. It was part of an argument between the state and the federal government as to whether states should be entitled to have militias, because Jefferson and others were opposed to a standing army, and they only wanted to have state armies, state militias, and that's what the Second Amendment was all about. And yet it's in there. And the Supreme Court has interpreted it to give a individual the right to have guns. That's probably a misinterpretation of the Constitution, but that's the law of the land today, and so we have to tragically live with it and die with it, and many people are dying with it.
Alan, would you advocate confiscating guns in the United States?
I would advocate confiscating guns from anybody with criminal record, anybody who's on the no-fly list. Did you see that? If you're on the no-fly list,
yes,
you can still get a gun. Did you see that the people who apply to get jobs in airports, people who have the capacity to put a bomb on a plane today, don't have to go through any more scrutiny than I had to go through when I wanted my quick pass that allows me to keep my shoes on when I get, through the metal detector.
Yes.
We have just not been able to deal with the new dangers that we face. We're still fighting World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and we have to recognize the fact that this is not the Third World War, as the Pope or others have said. This is a new kind of war, and we have to have the weapons available to fight this new kind of war.
Okay, I said earlier, you tragically, it's too strong, you unfortunately, your work has brought you into contact with very difficult, complex situations that sometimes involve violence.
Oh, yeah.
So, as far as you're concerned, if somebody says to you, I want a gun in my home, a handgun in my home, or a rifle in my home to protect my home, what would you say?
I would say, first of all, it's a very foolish idea. You're more likely to produce a death among one of your family members or yourself if you have a gun in your home than if you don't. Remember that 3 o'clock in the morning when the burglar comes in, that's the middle of his workday. He's energized. You're half asleep. And we know there are so many suicides resulting from guns. There are so many accidental deaths resulting from guns. Look, I am threatened all the time, physically threatened all the time. I had to have 2 FBI agents accompany me to class some years ago when a neo-Nazi put out a contract on my life. And yet, my family and I have made the decision not to have a gun. When I need protection, I hire a professional person to protect me, and I had to do that on many occasions. When I speak on college campuses today, I need armed guards.
Is that
accompanying me to and from the car?
Is that
because
true?
Because although students want to have safe places for their ideas, which they don't want to see contradicted, they don't want to give pro-Israel advocates physically safe spaces to even speak on university campuses. So I know what it means to confront violence. I have gotten calls from authorities saying there have been threats against your life. So I know what that means, but the decision to have a gun in your home is most often a foolish decision that endangers your family more than protects it.
Okay. At the same time, would you want a law restricting the ability to have or own a gun in your own home?
I would require a high showing of need before you could have, and also courses that you'd have to take, and mental health exams that you'd have to pass. Look, it's easier to get a gun than to drive, to drive a car today. I would make it much harder to get a gun and have a presumption against individual gun ownership, but the presumption could be overcome by a showing of need. That's the way it was in New York for many, many years. Now with the new Heller case, the Second Amendment case, gun control laws have been weakened. They haven't been gutted, but they've been weakened. So I'd like to see, my goal is fewer guns.
Yes.
Many, many, many fewer guns. And whatever it takes within the Constitution to bring about that desirable result, I would favor.
Okay. Now make a distinction for us between a handgun and an automatic gun, an automatic rifle, an assault rifle. How in the world can anybody justify individual Americans owning an assault rifle, Alan?
And particularly people say, oh, we need it for hunting. I mean, that's not hunting. That's brutality.
Right.
When you have an automatic weapon, you're going to go after a deer. That's not sports. That's not fun. That's a massacre. And it's very rare that a person would need an automatic weapon in their home. These assault weapons clearly were not contemplated by the framers of the Second Amendment. Plainly, what they had in mind was single-shot muskets. Now, obviously, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the Fourth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment all evolve over time. But the idea of automatic and semi-automatic weapons being personally owned by individuals instead of being owned by the armed forces and the police seems absurd. And a lot of these multiple deaths are caused by semi-automatic guns that can fire off large numbers of rounds in a very, very short period of time.
Would you be willing to legislate against the owning?
Yes, absolutely.
I would too.
Again, you'd have to show very, 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 very strong need, and it would have to be almost only police officers and military that could own automatic or semi-automatic weapons.
Okay, a sensitive question for you. Are Republicans at fault for the lack of more effective gun control
Yes,
legislation?
of course they are. Some Democrats too. It's interesting. I switched from supporting Eugene McCarthy back in 1968 to supporting Bobby Kennedy because Eugene McCarthy wouldn't support gun control. He came from Wisconsin, a state where gun ownership was very popular. Even Senator Sanders comes from New Hampshire with his gun ownership. So there are plenty of Democrats, but Sanders has done a pretty good job in distancing himself from the NRA. But lots of Democrats and most Republicans today are opposed to what would be meaningful and effective gun control, and they capitulate to the NRA, which is the most powerful lobby in America and has the ability to really thwart the will of the public. The American public wants effective gun control,
Yes.
but congressmen who are terrified of losing to single-issue voters on the gun issue will often vote against the majority of their constituents because they know that if they oppose the NRA, they're going to lose valuable contributions, and people will gang up on them, particularly in primaries where only a few voters vote, but all the NRA people vote in primaries to try to defeat anybody who has a rational approach to gun control.
Okay, one more time I press you. The argument against what you're saying is that the bad guys are always going to get the guns anyway, and the only people you're going to keep guns from are the good guys.
Well, that's just not true. If you look at Europe, if you look at Japan, the bad guys don't get the guns in Japan. Nobody gets the guns in Japan. Almost nobody gets the guns in England. Almost nobody, of course, in France. The very, very bad guys did manage to get guns, and that's a terrible tragedy. They also got explosives. They also got other kinds of weapons. But you've got to do what you can do. You can't allow the bad guys to become the lowest common denominator that establishes the law. If the bad guys have guns, we need to make sure the policemen can stop them and arrest them. It doesn't mean we want to. Remember, there was this great kind of spoof in All in the Family. We're talking 30, 40 years ago, when the star of the show, Archie Bunker, gets on television and says the answer to airplane hijacking is to require everybody who flies on an airplane to carry a gun.
Right.
That way, there'll be shootouts in the middle of the airplane, and we'll be able. That's not the answer. The answer isn't to arm teachers in school, to arm students. I've heard that proposal, to arm ministers, rabbis, priests, and churches. The answer is to make sure that the bad guys don't get access to the guns, and that's not going to be easy to do.
Yes.
It's much easier to stop people from getting guns than it is to disarm America.
Yes.
Because today there are so many guns that it would be very, very hard to disarm America.
Okay, and when you describe it and you say to us, most Republicans and even some Democrats are frightened of the NRA, it makes it sound, Alan, that as worthy and as just as you describe a cause to be, it's not likely to happen in America today.
Well, I think it would happen if you have courageous leadership and people who are prepared to take some political risks, but it's very, very hard to do.
Yes.
And, a lot of people running for office just don't want to incur the wrath of the NRA. Mm-hmm. But if the public rises up and says, we just have to get rid of the easy availability of guns in our society, I think we'll see elected representatives respond appropriately.
Okay, Alan, while I have you, another issue that many in the American Jewish community are particularly concerned about has to do with the fate of Jonathan Pollard, who was recently paroled after 30 years in prison. And Alan, many, many years ago, when I was doing L'Chaim on radio, I had the opportunity to interview your brother Nathan, who was also involved in the case.
But he represented the first wife of Jonathan Pollard at a time when I represented Jonathan Pollard. And what happened is, they basically extorted Pollard into pleading by threatening to put his wife in jail for a long, long, long period of time unless there was what was called a wired plea, unless they both pleaded together. Then Jonathan Pollard agreed to a plea bargain under which he would not get life imprisonment, in which the government promised that they wouldn't ask for life imprisonment. Then they broke their promise by submitting an affidavit by that perjurer, Caspar Weinberger, who hated Israel, hated Jews, hated his name, hated his face. Talk about a self-hating Jew. He was the poster child for a self-hating Jew, and he submitted a perjured affidavit in which he exaggerated and lied and got the judge to give Pollard life imprisonment. Pollard should have gotten 5 years in prison. That's what people got for spying for an ally rather than spying for an enemy. But instead he got life. He has served 25 years longer than he should have served. And now the government is being very outrageously punitive by demanding that he maintain these very difficult parole conditions and not be allowed to go to a country of which he's a citizen, namely Israel. And he's challenging that. He has very, very good young lawyers who are excellent and very devoted, and I hope they will succeed in getting some of these restrictions eliminated. I know they will succeed over time, but the question is, can they do it sooner rather than later? And I hope they will. He poses no danger. He knows no secrets. He poses no danger if he goes to Israel. He should be allowed to go to Israel.
Why do you feel the parole conditions were so draconian, Alan?
No, they're not. They're typical. I mean, the problem is, as applied to him, they're draconian. Usually, when you're getting out after 30 years of a life sentence, usually it's for a crime like multiple murders or rape or things like that. So it's typical to say we're going to have to report to your parole authority once a week. You have to do this. You have to wear a bracelet. Those are all typical, and they're okay when they're dealing with murderers and rapists who have high rates of recidivism. They're just not applicable to a man who did one thing out of zealotry and loyalty and is not in a position where he could ever recidivate or do it again. So they're routine, but they're unfair when applied to him.
Are they anti-Semitic? Is anti-Semitism at work here?
Well, I can tell you this. If Jonathan Pollard were not a Jew who had spied for the nation state of the Jewish people, he would not have gotten 30 years. He would not have gotten these onerous parole conditions. He would have been allowed to go back to a country of which he's a citizen, 20 or 25 years ago. So I don't like to use the term anti-Semitism unless I can prove it. But I can tell you what the prosecutor in the case said. The prosecutor in the case said Pollard had to get a longer sentence than typical because otherwise American Jews, and now I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, American Jews who feel a deep loyalty to Israel, raising the dual loyalty canard, will not be sufficiently deterred. In other words, because he was a Jew who spied for the nation state of the Jewish people, he needs a higher sentence than if it were an American of Egyptian background who spied for Egypt, or an American of Polish background who spied for Poland. And we've had those cases, and those people have gotten single-digit sentences. But Jonathan Pollard got a multiple of that because of the alleged fear that dually loyal Jews will not be sufficiently deterred by a 5-year sentence and might endanger the security of the United States. That is a totally anti-Semitic rationale for what was an outrageous sentence.
Of course, and it's a very upsetting thing for Jews to hear you say and understand, but I appreciate it.
It's true. I mean, I've heard it with my own ears, so I know it's true.
One more, again, it's a complex issue, and I want you to let me frame it exactly right.
Sure.
It's about the presidential primaries, especially the Republican primaries, Alan. And what I have seen on American television, and it goes across the board, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, even Fox, there is a concerted effort right now to tell the American people what a tragedy it would be if Donald Trump were elected president. I am not asking you to comment on Donald Trump. I'm asking you to comment from me on your view of the process. It seems as if the American journalist today, especially on television, is not so much a reporter giving Americans information and news, as those we see, the anchor on TV, is taking a journalistic role, as if their role is to influence American public opinion. You watch enough television. What's your sense of the process, Alan?
Well, I think the process is a very dangerous one, and it seeps from the editorial pages onto the news pages. The New York Times is one of the worst offenders. Its news reporting, I'm not talking about its editorials, its news reporting on Israel is so biased against Israel. You'll get a situation where a Palestinian terrorist knifes somebody and then is killed by an IDF or a police person from Israel, and the headline will focus on the Palestinian who was killed without giving context. That happens so often. And I think in the primaries, of course, people on the air are not allowed to take positions on who they support, but you don't have to read much through the lines to see who they support. Look, I know Donald Trump. I've met him. I've met him only in the nicest of circumstances.
Right.
I've always liked him. He's a likable guy.
Yes.
He's said a lot of things that are very upsetting and very disturbing, and it's very important to point out all those things. I think they should be pointed out no matter who the candidate is. That's the role of the journalist, to bring facts forward and let people judge for themselves. Fox announces, we present both sides and then you decide. That's just not the case. And none of the networks really are totally objective in the way they present the news, and that really is too bad. Now, look, it's also true of the BBC, which is supposed to be the paradigm of fairness, but when you look at the reporting the BBC does on Israel, it's appalling. I recently was at Oxford University, where I debated at the Oxford Union against the BDS movement, and I was told when I was asked to do the debate that the pro-Israel side never wins, but I decided to do it anyway, so I'll change some minds. I know I was going to lose, and I saw the audience, and the audience of the Oxford students was clearly biased against Israel because they read the BBC, hear the BBC, read the London newspapers, and miraculously we won the debate.
Good for you.
But it was, I could see from the questions and from the attitudes of the students that they had been so biased. The case I made was the case that the BDS movement hurts the peace process. So I made the kind of liberal left case against the BDS movement, which succeeded in persuading, a vast majority of the Oxford students who had open mind. But they have been so propagandized by the British press, the French press. So many European and so many American newspapers are biased against Israel, and they're also biased when it comes to political candidates. Of course, that's
yes.
right.
And why do you think it is, Alan, that people like Trump, Carson, Fiorino, those who are considered to be the outsiders, what do you think they've tapped into? Because everybody thought Trump would come and go in a day. They're all still running strong. Why?
Well, I think Carson's running less strong.
Yes, you're right.
He's not seen as particularly qualified on the issue of terrorism.
Correct.
It's interesting. At my age, I know a lot of these people. Fiorino's father was my friend and my colleague. He was a professor both at Harvard and Stanford Law School. And so I've known about Fiorino since she's a kid. I've known Donald Trump. Ted Cruz is my student. I've met with Jeb Bush. I've met with Rubio. Of course, I've known Hillary Clinton for forever. So, when you get to be my age, you know these people personally, and then you see how they're described on television. You say, that's not the person I know.
Right.
The person I know is very different. They're creating a stereotype, a stick figure image of the person, and that's not a service that's well performed by the media.
Alan, I always love talking to you. You've got to come in and let me talk to you about your new book on Abraham and Jewish law.
Okay, but you got to give the students their homework. That is, they all have to read the book
Exactly.
first, and
all
then
right.
we'll have a discussion about it, and then we'll give them a test, and we'll give them all A's.
Thank you so much. Alan, as always, look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Be well.
Bye.
Alan Dershowitz, former professor of law at Harvard Law School. His most recent book is entitled Abraham, the World's First, but certainly not last, Jewish Lawyer, available now on Amazon. And again, he always has incisive comments, and you can agree with him, you can disagree with him, but Alan makes you think. My thanks, as always, to Sloan Copeland, our director, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, and the producers of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal and Jan Weiss. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.